Welcome to the Michigan Works Association 2020 Annual Conference. My name is Stephanie Willis. I'm the Director of Communications with the Michigan Works Association. On behalf of the staff at the association and all of our sponsors, we thank you for being a part of the conference and this session titled Registered Apprenticeship Program, U.S. and German Models Back to Back. A big thank you to EDSI for sponsoring today's workshop session. Our sponsors help make this conference happen, and we are very grateful for their support. Along with our sponsors are exhibitors who have also given of their time to be a part of our event. Be sure to visit the exhibitor booth during the designated exhibit hall time. Please make sure your audio is muted. If you have a question during the presentation, you can enter it in the chat and the presenters will answer it as time allows. We are eager for your feedback about the conference in this session. Please take a few moments to complete the short survey. The link to the survey has been posted in the chat and will be posted again in the chat at the end of the session. Presentations will be available post-conference on the Michigan Works Association website. Remember that you can click twice on what is being presented to make it larger for easier viewing. And now I would like to introduce your speakers for this session. Joe Thiry, Business Solutions Manager with West Michigan Works. Amy Lebednick, Business Solutions Director with West Michigan Works. Laura Schoenborn-Preuss, Workforce Development Human Resources Manager with Dewys Manufacturing. Lee Graham, Executive Director for Labor Management and Education with the International Union of Operating Engineers, Local 324, Michigan. And Melinda Mack, Executive Director of New York Association of Training and Employment Professionals.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for the introduction, Stephanie. We'll be talking today a little bit about registered apprenticeship programs, really comparing the U.S. and German models. We were all of us on the panel here. We're fortunate enough to be able to go over there last year in November. Actually, Luann Dunsford was with us on that trip as well, and we learned a lot of good things. And we wanted to report that back to everyone and try to answer some questions about what we saw, some of the key takeaways, what we can do moving forward, because we know not everyone can visit on a regular basis. So what we'll do today, just a few housekeeping items as well. If you do have questions, we will have a time for question and answer at the end of the session. Hopefully we'll have a decent amount of time for that. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat. We'll try to answer them as we go along, but we'll also have that dedicated time at the end. I'm going to be doing a little bit of an introduction here at the beginning, and then we're going to take the bulk of our time to do some question and answer with the panelists here. As I go through our short presentation, just as a reminder, if you want to see the slides larger, just double click on the window to maximize the slides there. So we'll get right into it. As you can see, the picture that we have is the delegation that we did have, along with a couple of our German hosts at one of our stops. This was kind of a unique trip because we were able to have both individuals from the state of Michigan and from the state of New York actually go on this trip with us. And I know we wanted to be able to present this information in person, but it's kind of nice that we can do it virtually. So Melinda can call in from the state of New York as well. So it was a good trip in terms of having different viewpoints from different states, also having different viewpoints from those of us in Michigan. So when we go through the panels, you'll see that we have a lot of different representation from different workforce stakeholders, which was great as well. So there's me. I'm Joe Thiry, Manager of Business Solutions at West Michigan Works. Part of my role is to help oversee some of our apprenticeship programs and apprenticeship development in our area as well. So this this knowledge sharing trip was pretty helpful for me to be able to see a model that works quite well and what we can do to try to emulate some of that. Some of the key takeaways we're going to have today is kind of get an understanding of that knowledge sharing between different stakeholders, how valuable that was. I'm taking away a few key takeaways from this experience, what can be implemented here in the U.S., and then just a comparison on what we're doing well, what things that we can try to improve on from a viewpoint of a lot of different stakeholders. Like Stephanie mentioned, our panelists are Amy Lebednick from West Michigan Works, Laura Preuss from Dewys Manufacturing, Melinda Mack with the New York Association of Training and Employment Professionals, or NIATEP, and Lee Graham with the International Union of Operating Engineers, Local 324 in Michigan. Like I mentioned, having this group is such a diverse, different background was really great because we got to be able to see viewpoints from private employers, from labor unions, from workforce in Michigan, and from workforce in New York as well. So it was a really great trip, being able to see all of those different opinions and be able to talk about some items. So to kind of get into it, we had a nice long flight over to Germany. Once we got there, we went from the airport over to Bonn, which is, I would say, the second capital of Germany. So just for a little bit of history lesson, in West Germany, Bonn was the capital. So there is a large federal presence there. So they still have a lot of the federal workers, and including some of the federal workers who work specifically on apprenticeship programs. So that was our first stop, was learning from the German federal government. Interesting thing is that they have an entire division really basically set up to be able to do these knowledge sharing experiences, teaching other countries, other people about how their system works in general. A few key takeaways that we had from there. I'm going to just offer up a few stats that we learned. 5% of their workforce are apprentices. Doesn't sound like all that much. However, just based off some really basic Google searches that I did, it's less than 0.5% in the U.S. So comparatively, we are behind in that. Now that does make sense considering that it's kind of instilled in their system. 20% of companies in Germany offer apprenticeships, so it's not as widespread as we might think. Still pretty significant though. They estimate that 70 to 80% of apprentices are staying with their company, and it only drops down to about 65% staying with the company for over 5 years. And the average cost for an employer is around 18,000 euro, which we'll kind of get into real quickly on this slide. One of the interesting things that I saw was, in their dual vet system, it's very similar to what we're looking at. 70% of the investment and time is spent at the company and 30% in school. Kind of the difference, though, is that the vocational education piece is fully funded by taxpayers and the government, and the part that's funded by the company is a little. They're able to pay an apprenticeship salary, often 1,000 euros a month stipend or less. So it's a little bit different than what some of the factors that we're working with here in the U.S. From there, we went and we learned from the Institute of Labor Economics. A few key takeaways that we had was that the participation rate in apprenticeships is actually dropping currently. They are kind of going into a trend where universities are becoming a little bit more popular and a little more preferred. And it was interesting that when we asked questions about how they're figuring out the return on investment for employers, it was almost shrugged off a little bit in terms of saying that's not really a driving force behind their apprenticeship programs, as it's kind of just understood that they have different apprenticeship, or they have different return on investment for apprenticeships. From Bonn, we went to Cologne, and from there, we were actually able to visit one of the vocational education centers. We visited a private school, which is more rare. It's less than 5% of the education is actually private in Germany. Most of it is public and fully funded, is free. Now, one thing, whether you're private or public, all trained providers have to be approved by the state. They have a little bit different system. So, quite often, like their chambers of commerce do different things than what we do, often including approving different training providers. And then students have to pass national examinations for different occupations. Their estimates were that they have a nearly 100% placement record for those students who pass the examinations due to that national standard being absolutely recognized. We were also able to visit with those in the city government and a few apprentices who work for the city. So that's kind of an interesting different shift that we saw. We don't really recognize and see a lot of apprenticeships in our government work. We're more looking at, the skilled trades, and they kind of look at it for a lot of different things. And as you can see, quick stat on that was they had over 6,000 applicants for around 580 different apprenticeship opportunities for the government in 2019. So a huge amount of interest, kind of a different way to, build your talent from a government standpoint. They were also able to give us a background of the German educational system. I'll just leave this up here for a second. I'm not going to try to explain it because it'd probably take the rest of the presentation. But the really interesting thing was that even by about 5th grade, the teachers are sort of, working with the parents or almost telling parents and directing the student into one of these secondary levels and kind of telling them this is where they're going. It was kind of something that when we talked about it, just wasn't something that really was, we think, a plausible thing that would happen in the United States, which was kind of interesting. There's a lot of different paths, and you can get to the same endpoint through all of these paths, but they kind of spell it out a lot earlier in life than we do in the States. Finally, we were able to also learn from local manufacturers. That was great to be able to actually get into a manufacturing environment, see a private employer, and what they do with their apprenticeship program. It was pretty interesting that they actually work with other employers to pay into a training center where they pool together their apprentices and they all train together before they go into the work environment. Apprentices did not step foot into the company until they had completed 7 months of training. So, imagine that, not one bit of work done at the company, and you're paying this person for 7 months. That was pretty interesting. And apprentices are responsible ultimately for finding their own opportunities. So that when we talked to this young man, I think he had either found it in the newspaper and then he had just gone up and showed up at the company and said he wanted to work as an apprentice. So kind of a different mindset at times than sometimes that we might take. So obviously we had a wide variety of experiences on this visit over there. So we're going to leave it up to the rest of the panelists to be able to kind of dive into that a little deeper, talk about their experience a little bit more, and we'll kind of go over a few different topics that we'll focus on. So one of the things that we thought was pretty valuable and interesting for this experience was the fact that kind of some of the why behind a trip like this. A lot of it's about sharing knowledge, working with other people, knowing that you can't do things yourself. So in order to gain a clear understanding of why this trip was taken, I think we'll just have people talk about why they looked outside of just their local system and the same stakeholders to be able to take this trip and what they kind of got out of it. So I'm going to start with Melinda. So over in New York, what drove you to seek out this opportunity, and why did you look outside your local system?
Sure, and I can also describe why we decided to do it with Michigan, right? So I am the Luann of New York, if folks are wondering. And so Luann and I have been talking for many years at this point around how we could really change the approach and interest around apprenticeship across New York and Michigan. We had colleagues who had traveled to Switzerland. We had sort of dug around to see where were there real models that we thought we could potentially export pieces of it to the United States and to our own respective states. And we settled on Germany, and we settled on Germany versus Switzerland because in many ways the German model has those key pieces that I think we really could do here in our states. And we'll talk a little bit about what those are in a few minutes, but also because there was a real interest in having common companies that we have in the US who are already sort of operating really high attended, well-received apprenticeship programs in New York and Michigan. You think about Siemens, you think about some of the big companies that you hear frequently that do apprenticeship really well, especially with young adults. I think that's part of why we chose Germany. From our perspective, I think we also saw a huge value in going with another state, because then over dinner, over really tall German beers or really small ones if we were in Cologne. It gave us a chance to actually say, wait a second, you do it this way? We don't do it this way. Why? Wait, you can do it that way? Like there's a lot of exchange around just the differences even within our own states. New York is a SAC state, and so our state makes up the rules for apprenticeship. It's a little different than if you're a part of the federal system. And it really allowed us, I think, to also dissect and compare and contrast state to state as well as the US to the German model. Since we've come back, I will say the amount of interest specifically around youth apprenticeship in many ways has exploded. And so how do we really think about connecting 16 to 24-year-olds or 25-year-olds to pipelines directly related to employment pathways? And how do we use apprenticeship as a tool and model? And I'd like to think that our trip to Germany in many ways inspired a huge amount of that work, because folks said, wait a second, you really can have a kid on a shop floor at 14 or 15 and help them start to see what that looks like. I'm going back to the business that we went to see. And I remember walking with Laura, we were walking through and we saw this kid and we're thinking, what is this child doing in this manufacturing floor? And we realized he was there for a work experience and a job shadowing. And that I think really opened our eyes to how many different ways we could look at and think about apprenticeship in our state.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the things I think about when you talk about engaging youth was, I think we had some stats around the fact that the youth unemployment over there was hovering just a little over 6%, and at the time it was at least double that here in the U.S., which is significantly a growing issue. And how do we engage people more too? I'm going to shift it over to Laura. So talking from a private industry perspective, what did your organization really see in terms of value? Why did they end up supporting you to go on this trip?
Okay. So I think you can hear me okay? Okay. There's really primarily two reasons. I think my company was so interested in engaging in this conversation. I think first and foremost, we've had a good business relationship with Michigan Works for a number of years, working alongside Michigan Works in a variety of different projects. So my leadership was well aware of all the activities Michigan Works was engaged in and trying to, I think, push the envelope in the conversation around youth in the workplace, apprenticeships, career pathways, and the list could go on. I think, though, also a big piece of why I was able to participate is just because it's part of my company's personal nature to be more active in these conversations and less passive about them. We look to try to help to change what the conversation is here in our state, both locally with other companies that we work with and on a bigger picture with some of the entities that we work alongside, like Michigan Works. We want to help to make some things change in our state. And we know, and I guess I personally know, that the German model had, I think, some opportunity for us to learn and to bring back, and to be one of just a few people to be able to go to Germany and be able to study that model and bring it back was not only personally a really great experience, but I think as a company it was something that we could say, hey, why are other employers not doing it, and start to have some of those conversations with them also. But it was a really great experience to be able to bring something back, and I'm very much appreciative of the fact that my company allowed me to do it.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, it was awesome to be able to have that private employer viewpoint on it as well. In workforce, we have the way we view things, but ultimately we want to make sure that the employers have their viewpoint seen as on it at the same time. So you kind of talked about your relationship with Michigan Works, West Michigan Works specifically. I'm gonna throw it over to Amy and just kind of give a level set on some of the things that we do at West Michigan Works for apprenticeships, and how that mirrors kind of like apprenticeship development in the state of Michigan as well.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. A few years ago, with financial support from the state of Michigan, we brought on a full-time apprenticeship success coordinator. And we committed to keeping that individual on staff after the funding went away. So the role of this staff person at West Michigan Works is to help employers create and expand apprenticeship opportunities. Why is it so important to seek more knowledge on this? Well, we know that there is a compelling narrative around return on investment for companies, workers, government, society, the economy in general. And we continue to see the demand for skilled talent grow, not just in Michigan, but across the nation. And registered apprenticeship programs are an important and viable option for companies to be able to train individuals in the skills that they need and making sure that their businesses remain competitive. And those learning experiences allow us to apply best practices to expand apprenticeship programs, which in turn provide high wage and in-demand career pathways to individuals in our communities. So lastly, how we're supporting apprentices is making sure that we're knowledgeable and having access to federal, state, and community grants that support and incentivize employers to create apprenticeship programs. And we are quite often able to provide or act as a conduit for those funds and look at all of the available funding opportunities to support employers and offering braided funding opportunities.
Perfect, thanks. And I want to just have a quick follow-up with Melinda, because you mentioned, there's some of the differences between New York and Michigan, and just for the audience's knowledge, can you talk for a minute about, kind of the biggest differences that you have as a state when you hear kind of some of the work that's going on here in Michigan?
Yeah, so again, going back to the fact that New York is a SAC state, and thinking about one of the things that we took away from our colleagues in Michigan was just how critical local workforce boards are in providing that intermediary space to connect the business community to the workforce system related to apprenticeship. And so in our state, it really is driven right now still by the union system and the public union system, primarily the building trades. And so it's very union heavy. We actually had a group of someone who represented a group of employers with us as well. Her name was Martha. She represented the Manufacturers Association of New York. And one of the things that they've done since coming back is really dramatically expanding the role that the association, the State Association for Manufacturers, plays in that intermediary space, including expanding some of those intermediary hubs across New York. But it comes back to the fact that, because of the differences in structure, our ability to fund apprenticeships through the WIOA system have been really limited. And in some ways, I think we thought maybe we just can't do it. Maybe we're not allowed. Maybe there's a structural reason within the law or within the regulations that makes it difficult. But in reality, it came down to talking to Amy and to Joe to realize, no, actually, you could dedicate a ton of business service time to this. You can actually use this as part of your training component that you support employers with, and more importantly, use it as a pathway and pipeline development program. And so again, I think some of the major differences is right now we really don't have a ton of WIOA dollars that go into the workforce system as it relates to apprenticeship.
And you mentioned some of the union involvement there, and I'll segue me to go over to Lee. So Lee, I'm not ignoring you over here. You've been called out by everyone in the comments, so I think Lee can say he's the most popular person on our panel right now.
No.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual time we were spending there. We kind of have the level set of why we went on the trip, some of the things that we do respectively as states. But can you talk a little bit, especially from your perspective with different training programs, a little bit about when we were there, comparing the different models, that talk a little bit about the insights that you have of how the German system really helped provide some of those hands-on career exploration activities, what you took away from it, especially students at a young age, and how we might be able to get some ideas from it.
Thank you, Joe. Be glad to. One thing that I know just throughout that trip was the importance, just exposing the students to the potential careers in the industry. So Laura kind of brought that up, and Amy as well in that discussion. But in our sector in construction, we see it all the time. The students who most commonly apply for entering the apprenticeship programs are the ones that have had skilled trades in their family or learned about them in school. So the students gravitate towards careers, that they see firsthand and are inspired by. And of course, we all know the numbers are fulfilling our needs. So our infrastructure requires, a much larger workforce. The part I really enjoyed was it got brought up about the German model. All 7th graders, required 3 weeks of internship. So it's like when we did walk in that shop and we seen that opportunity and we seen the difference of the youth, like Laura and Amy pointed out, it was phenomenal. So it all stopped us in our tracks and we're like, okay. And we've seen that, a couple other times. So that was truly encouraging. And so, what I say is showing the students, the variety of the different careers and giving them a hands-on experience at a much younger than usual. We're able to here in Michigan. I put down 7th grade is at least 2 or maybe even 4 years earlier that we are typically able to make the first employer job site opportunities with these students. So when we look at that, what being said, it's also worth mentioning that, there are limitations. We've had limitations. Obviously, safety is always the number one concern. We work in the construction sector. 7th graders are not, typically on job sites. But what we have is we have the advantage of technology because even during our COVID that we're continually, going through right now, we've been able to use the advanced technology and the virtual platforms and the Zoom. So we've kept our pre-apprenticeships going, if you will, like our Detroit Workforce of the Future. We were able to carry like 13 students all the way through from March in a 16-week program. And so what we did was we had all the different training directors were able to bring that ladder safety and that trench collapse and each Friday, be able to show those segments from their training centers. But the coolest part of it all was when we were able to go to a live Fiat Chrysler auto plant where we were building it. And we had an operating engineer apprentice step down out of the cab of a brand new bulldozer, took his mask off. He was actually a first-year apprentice, and he got to speak to all those students. And he said, this has been a phenomenal opportunity, to be able to get an apprenticeship, right? The whole earn and learn model. And he said, I got my first apartment. He said, I got a girlfriend. And so he went on to say, just how awesome it was. So we were able to go live there via Zoom. So those are things that, during these times that it's kind of, taken us some different ways. So talking about that, just with equipment simulators, the idea of reaching the kids early, telling them about the careers that are possible in the different industries, including ours and those that are inspired. And just kind of closing out, the more that we can show the work sites to these students, starting at an early 7th grade, the more likely we'll be able to identify and attract them, to a field, that they find satisfying. And the biggest part is having success in. So like everybody's already touched on it earlier, we did learn a lot from each other from New York and Michigan. And that was pretty amazing. So thank you, Joe.
Yeah. Well, and thanks for talking about how it kind of goes back to what you're seeing in the real world right now. And I think that transitions, there were parts that we saw, we had discussions every night of, hey, we wish we could do something like this. And we feel like we're a little bit behind of what they're doing. But there were certainly times that we were talking about how we think we're outpacing some of the activities they're doing there. So actually, Amy, I'm going to have you kind of talk a little bit about when you look at some of the career exploration activities that are going on between the two systems, where do you kind of think that we might be doing a really good job and where we can continue to provide that as well?
Sure. So the German model does very well is providing ample opportunity for youth to experience jobs in person and on site at the employer's location, as you've heard some of the speakers present. However, there did not appear to be much access for career exploration opportunities prior to seeking those on-site work-based learning opportunities. And when speaking with college students at one of our site visits in Germany, they also expressed that they were really on their own to figure out what the right job and career pathway might be for them. I think that a key strength, at least in West Michigan, is really strong partnerships between workforce, industry, and education. And because of that, we are able to do career exploration pretty well. This includes promoting our high demand industries, dispelling myths with some of those industries, offering opportunities and resources for youth to learn and providing opportunities for youth to have exposure to a variety of careers and career pathways within those high demand industries. One example of this would be My Career Quest, where we bring in peers within industry and they create these hands-on exhibits to provide those exposure opportunities to the youth. The youth come in and they are learning hands-on from individuals that do those jobs and learning about careers that they never even knew existed. You know, career coaching opportunities and tools and resources, even online, just to offer career exploration to youth and even adults that may be looking for career changes or maybe career pathway opportunities that offer more sustainable wages.
Absolutely, and there was actually a question about My Career Quest in the chat, so I think that was that's a good topic to kind of, and we can get to that specific question at the end if we have some time as well. I want to know though, Laura, from your perspective, you know, from a private employer on this trip, you know, as we saw some of the career exploration things going on, what were some of your like real takeaways that you had that you thought were interesting between the two systems?
Yeah, there were a couple really interesting things. I think first and foremost, their apprenticeships go beyond just what we would talk about with skilled trades. Whether you were in a business or if you were working at a hotel, there were a lot of different types of apprenticeships, and they were widely accepted and valued, not just by employers, but by families and I think the community to which they were in, which I think is hugely important to being able to get to the level of the apprenticeships that they have there. What was very interesting from my standpoint too is that manufacturers work so well in collaborating on what the requirements were for each of the programs. So part of the government initiative was to connect with the employers and use them to understand, okay, what does it mean to get an apprenticeship out of whatever program it was that they were doing, and to constantly have that line of communication going on. I think the collaboration was quite good on that part of things. Something though that I found very interesting, and I don't know that we are as good at it in the United States yet, is the standardization and the certification part of it. So when students get out of an apprenticeship in Germany, they take a standardized testing, they go through whatever the final, I guess, presentation process to certify that they have that apprenticeship completed. And it is standard across the board. So if they were going to company A or company B with that apprenticeship, they would know exactly what it meant and would view it exactly as that. Where there's a little bit of a struggle in terms of some of what I see here in that there isn't always the standardization. We have more customization, which can be very nice, but doesn't then always mean the exact same thing from company A to company B. So it was very interesting from my standpoint in looking at the two systems, just how collaborative they really are, and in ensuring that across the board there is that clarity to what the outcomes should be, and that it's standard and recognized, and then, like I said, accepted and valued across the board to the students, the parents, the industries that they were working with.
Absolutely, some big differences and some goals of where to go as well. So Melinda, we had talked about I know on the trip and then even afterwards too, you know, some of the big differences even just in their K through 12 system. So we talk about, you know, some career exploration activities, but also you know, their education system just seems a little bit different when it comes to K through 12, going into some career pathways and seeing value around youth apprentices. Can you talk a little bit about some of your key takeaways from, you know, that topic?
Sure, and I think it might even answer one of the questions around the pre-apprenticeship training. It's not really structured in Germany like a pre-apprenticeship training. You, in many ways, enter into the track, and as you enter into the track, your schedule is sort of aligned with your work experience, which again is very different than what we do here in the U.S. Often the businesses are trying to fit into the school schedule. The difference is the vocational education fits into the employer-based schedule. So for example, when we were in the city of Cologne, they had through their dual VET program, which is the vocational education and training program, they had structured the days to meet the needs of the city employment, where you're in school 2 days a week and then worked 3 days a week. And so I share that because it is a little bit different than how we do things here. I think we're often sort of scrambling in K-12 to figure out how we get students in for 2 hours or 3 hours at, in our state is called BOCES, or Boards of Cooperative Education, which is CTE. And then how do we bus them for some work experience to a job site and bring them back? It's very, again, very different in terms of the approach. It also allows, I think, again, for students to specialize a lot earlier. And again, depending on your views on the educational system, we certainly debated it on the bus. There's like back and forth around, is it good to track students into certain occupations so early on in their career? But what we heard is you actually can bounce around. And I think the value of having this structured set that Laura spoke about of competencies, requirements, understanding of sort of like the math and German language like acquisition you need to have, like you're able to transport or it's portable across all these different disciplines. And so there is opportunity again for students to shift and change depending on where they sort of land within the educational system. The last thing that I will say is I also think the big piece that I took away, and Laura again asked this question when we were at a manufacturer, is just the understanding of the fact that these are young adults. Like these are kids who are going through an educational learning experience. And like our expectations should be that they are kids, not that they are full-grown adults who understand everything about work. I think Laura had asked the question about what happens when the students don't show up on time, or do students not show up on time? And they're like, yeah, of course they don't show up on time. They're 15, like they're terrible about showing up on time. But it's part of our job as an employer to really support the education about work and what work experience looks like within this program. So going back to like when I think about our CTE programs or our K-12 programs associated with employment, it's like the 3 strikes and you're out. You show up 3 times, you're late, you're out. It's like very much a punitive system versus like a lifelong learning experience.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and then you kind of talk about some of these moments that pop up that provide, in my mind, here these aha moments, right? So, I kind of want to shift into talking about some of these things that just kind of resonated with you, kind of stuck with you a little bit. So I'm going to start with Lee to talk a little bit about some of your viewpoint on what stuck with you in terms of looking at how the German model created like specific lanes for students and kind of that trend of people shifting towards university as opposed to apprenticeships.
Thank you, Joe. So one of the things that was interesting is to see how basically the 2 tracks, which Melinda just touched on in Germany's system of the registered apprenticeship or, the college or university. For the past several years, they feel that they've driven many students towards a registered apprenticeship path. And they're trying to recalibrate. This is what we heard while you're over there, trying to recalibrate now to increase the interest in their university and their research program. So we did hear that when we were there, and this is obviously the opposite of us here in the United States. For many years, we had pushed students towards the collegiate post-secondary education. And recently, we've worked hard in partnership with the industry and the educators to restore those CTE programs because we recognize that the kind of skilled trades careers in the CTE, how it prepares and basically, we're particularly underserved. So we also, have more lanes, for the students than 2 favored by the Germany. So when we look at that, so it became apparent that predicting, future workforce needs is very much a fluid thing. And we must, be able to adapt, to the changing needs. To see another country, with a well-developed program having challenges not dissimilar from ours speaks to how universal the issues are. So balance is the key. We talked about it many times during our trip and after our sessions, each day. The workforce needs people, right? Building careers in every sector, throughout. And we need to be able to inform and educate the students to what those careers entail and require. So we have to really help guarantee the success moving forward. So that was my takeaway.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. One of the things I thought was interesting from this trip was being able to have some of the stakeholders who went really be able to learn from their peers over there. So Laura, I'm gonna pass it over to you to kind of talk about some of your big takeaways, eye-opening moments from when we were all at that manufacturing environment, specifically on how they connected with youth and how that whole process worked.
Sure, I found it quite a bit different than what we do here in the United States. As Melinda talked, it was amazing to see really the youth working in the manufacturing shop. It wasn't just a matter that they were coming in for a tour. They were actually working in whatever capacity that meant for the company in that facility. And that was something that we learned about there, is that the young men and women there are actually seeking the apprenticeship. It's not as much about the employer necessarily seeking out the apprentice. I think that goes back a bit to the value of the apprenticeship and what that holds to the community and the family and the environment that they're in there. But it got me thinking, because from the state of Michigan alone, you can't be an apprentice here unless you've graduated from high school. You have to have a high school diploma in order to even get into apprenticeship. And it really made me, I guess it was an aha moment for me. I came back to Michigan. I asked a lot of questions and did some learning on my own to understand why is it that from the state level, because anything can be done if we truly look at it from the standpoint of, look at what we did as New York and Michigan deciding to go to Germany to learn about a model. Why can't we look at different ways of approaching getting young adults interested in the different trades? And I think it speaks to the fact that it's more valued, it's more common in Germany, and we need to make it a more valued and more common conversation here in the United States to start with, and be allowed to get these students more actively involved, not passive engagement, but more active engagement of their part, to be able to really understand what the careers and the opportunities are that all of us in the various sectors of business can showcase to them on any given level. So it was just really fascinating just how much more open the doors are for youth to be able to connect to the employers in various different industries there.
Absolutely, and I think that'll be something that'll be good to kind of get into the next question about what our next steps are. But before we do, one thing I want to ask Amy is talking about something it's almost kind of topical now as well, as we kind of go through some different conversations about developing equitable access to career pathways and in-demand careers. Removing barriers and making sure that everyone in our society is able to have an opportunity to gain meaningful employment. We had conversations about the German system and how that what wasn't necessarily a focus. I'm talking a little bit about some of your insights on what you saw, and then also what we're trying to do as well.
Mm-hmm. So the low youth unemployment rate and robust on-site learning opportunities were very impressive, but our delegation was particularly interested in efforts Germany made to accommodate individuals that faced barriers to employment, such as those with a disability, formerly incarcerated individuals, or individuals that fall into the long-term unemployed category. So while we did hear that apprenticeships are encouraged for unemployed groups in Germany, there did appear to be limited access for that population when compared to youth that were attending school. So we were left with some questions about how these groups are best served. Here back in the United States, New York, for instance, Melinda, I know you expressed that your state is very active at reaching out to young people from populations that may be faced with employment barriers, immigrants, people living with physical limitations. And similarly in Michigan, we have many programs that focus on equitable workforce access, career learning opportunities, and even scholarships. And that's for youth with barriers, as well as adults that are under or unemployed and may not have access to those opportunities otherwise. At West Michigan Works, we also place emphasis on partnering with organizations in our community for outreach so that we can have a wide reach to individuals and ensure that they are aware of workforce-related opportunities, including registered apprenticeship programs. And as a result of that, we have seen enrollment of diverse candidates increase twofold for our apprenticeship programs when those efforts are made. And so that was just some of the disparities that we saw between the German model and what we are doing here in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great to share. I think it's definitely a piece to be able to consider and when you're moving forward, so that you're not leaving people out of that equation. So I want to kind of get into our last official question and briefly talk about next steps. So Laura had some good talk about building value around apprenticeships. How do we really do that? So obviously not everyone's going to have a chance to go over there, study the system, and get these key takeaways. I think we were fortunate that we got to do that pre-COVID era. So kind of I'll go around and just kind of have everyone share a little bit about, not everyone can go over there. Name a few things that you can do from your perspective to help move things forward and help move the conversation forward. So Lee, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I think around just the expanded policies and apprenticeships, so there's two main things that we invest a lot of time in and energy, from the policy side, and both were really reinforced by this trip. The first is the value of good pre-apprenticeship programs. I've seen it coming up through the chat areas. It's super vital right now. It's something that hasn't been talked about in the past a lot. So that really has taken front stage. And our biggest thing is that these programs teach the students, what it takes to become a skilled tradesperson. So the more that we can establish funding and support for these programs, the more opportunities we can offer the students, to build the rewarding careers. So when we look at that, the more, this probably the second is the support of the CTE programs. For far too long, we've heard this multiple times about the programs being the casualties of the budget, right, with the funding. And so we've seen where we've been, where we've gone, and currently where we're at right now. So we see now that, the loss of these programs is catastrophic. We need to restore and support these programs. So because of the students, enter in and learn, and them are far more likely to find a career that inspires them and provides them a successful career. We find ourselves kind of in a unique place where we're grateful for the opportunities it provides. And Amy, brought it up earlier. When you look at like the Gordie Howe Bridge, it's a $5.7 billion project, right? They're going to build it, from Michigan and over to Canada. So we're going to meet them halfway in the middle. What has to happen? It has to happen not only in that area, but throughout and across the state as these economic opportunities. We have to have the economic opportunities, right? We got to be able to place these individuals into these amazing registered apprenticeships. So when you look at that, groups like, Bridging North America, right? That's the team that's leading this project. We look at urban neighborhood initiatives that we partner with out of that community down there. So we ended up taking pre-apprenticeships into those communities, and we're able to showcase, and we're able to clean up alleys and do different gardens and different, projects that we do with the skilled trades. And that gave interest to the communities about the flyers and the registered apprenticeships and how to access. And so we said, the pre-apprenticeships was kind of the door opening to there, which led to the USDOL registered apprenticeships, that we're talking about today. The MySTEM, the school districts, the Michigan Works, and the professional trades, and then mostly our employers, right? So what do? Their give is like, donating equipment and donating materials and making the communities really see this opportunity. So when we look at that, like I said, we're partnering, as a hub. So in the professional trades, we talk to business, we find out what the employees, what employees they need and what the employees need. So we talk to educators, we share with what those students, who will become workforce, what they need to know, to be successful. We talk to the government to find out the opportunities for the workforce, as well as share the endless possibilities in our field. Sorry about that. And of course, we provide, the members with a lifelong training and the support that will enrich, their lives and make them, productive. Because, when it is, sorry about that once again, when it becomes these entities, we work together that we have the most successful workers for the students, for the business, and of course our state, as a whole. So we talked earlier too, I wanted to bring up the fact, just the addition of different initiatives, through the governor's office here in Michigan, with the 60 by 30, 60%, by 2030, the post-secondary credentials. Well, guess what? The registered apprenticeship fits that mark. So that's a good piece, you know, with Leo leading the way with the workforce boards. We have a new My Yarn and My Rain youth apprenticeships that have recently been captured by the state of Michigan. So that's super exciting. So we talk about youth. And of course, the My STEM, the Michigan workforce boards, and it got brought up earlier about the business service coordinators through the Michigan Works agencies. We have a conference call coming up to where we're all able to meet each other and talk about what we do in the different trades with all the 16 Michigan Works agencies. So we are doing really good things, and just wanted to share on those notes. So thank you, Joe.
Absolutely, and I agree. I think there's some great things going on, and I'll say again, I feel like Lee's the most popular guy, and he's even getting phone calls during this. So and handling it gracefully. So thanks, Lee, for sharing that. And you mentioned some of the stuff that we're talking about with private employers. So I want to shift it over to Laura here and kind of ask you a question. So we have a lot of Michigan Works staff, workforce stakeholders in the audience. From your perspective, what's one key point of advice that you, because we're always trying to get, you know, that key insight from employers. What's one key insight from you that some of the Michigan Works staff can take to connect with their local industry and you know, keep engaged with you know, their local manufacturers?
Sure. I think there's always that piece of the why and the how. Why do you do this? Why get involved in apprenticeships to begin with? And then how do you get involved in the apprenticeship? I think one thing that's been extremely valuable here on the west side of Michigan, at the very least, is that they have the ability to help me get, excuse me, through the paperwork process of an apprenticeship. And I think that's a lot of value, because a number of employers may get stuck on that piece alone, because there is paperwork, there is Department of Labor, there is some different entities to which you have to work with. But when you have somebody like Michigan Works that can take a bit of that load off of you and allow you to really kind of still focus on the employment practices that you need to deal with, that's a huge opportunity. But then if you have that, well, how do you still get them enrolled? And that's really, I can't express enough how finding somebody who's had success in an apprenticeship program is a value here, because oftentimes in manufacturing, we're extremely competitive, and we like to know that if my competitor to my left is doing an apprenticeship program and they're having success, well, how do I have that same type of success? Or if other people in the industry are going through apprenticeships and having success, how do I get involved in that? And oftentimes there's very much get stuck in the weeds. Sometimes there isn't somebody in the manufacturing and specific environment who can focus solely on getting an apprenticeship going. So helping to connect them to somebody who has been successful in that in another entity, a similar entity, can make for huge value and be able to grow what you're trying to do there. But I can't thank the Michigan Works staff here enough. I've got one of my own apprenticeships going through working with them, and it's been a much easier process. So having that collaboration with them is huge. So if you have that, exploit it. And then if you have some valued employers that you work with who are passionate, who have successes that they can bring to the table, those are the people that you need to take along with you on some rides to talk to some of these other employers. Because by showing some of that and showing how maybe easy the process really is, or showing the return on the investment at the end of going through and paying for an apprenticeship, is going to severely get that program going a lot faster for them when they can see that and hear that.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, I think that's a great perspective to have for a lot of the people who are listening in today. I think we're always looking to try to find, you know, what works and figure and make that happen across the state as well. And you mentioned, you know, partnering with your local Michigan Works, some of the things that you do. So I wanted to take it over to Amy to kind of expand on that a little bit. You know, how West Michigan Works has viewed, you know, the role of kind of the neutral convener of apprenticeships, how we work with employers, and how we see that moving forward.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that partnerships are very important in really being able to make an impact. And West Michigan Works has been involved in several different regional collaborations to address talent, curriculum, and advocacy issues. These collaborative efforts bring employers and community partners together to address talent shortages and work towards building a pipeline of talent for the future. Specifically, something that West Michigan Works has committed to doing is convening and coordinating key workforce stakeholders in our high demand industries to form industry talent councils and bringing those partners together to discuss the talent needs and then also how we can overcome workforce challenges. So these employer-led talent councils are supported by education, both K through 12 and post-secondary, economic development, and workforce. And with West Michigan Works serving as the backbone support to these industry talent councils, we can be that neutral convener that allows stakeholders to facilitate the discussion, which then leads to the development of projects and implementing initiatives that help fill that talent pipeline for employers and also providing access to opportunities for everyone in our community. And each of our industry talent councils does focus on apprenticeships, both creating and expanding opportunities within the West Michigan Works region. And so that's one way how we've been able to act as a neutral convener when it comes to apprenticeships.
Awesome, thanks, Amy. I'm gonna give it over to Melinda for our final thoughts here. So just as a whole, if you had 2 to 3 things that you could recommend to our audience on moving forward, what would those be?
Yeah, and in fact, I'll even say that there's things that we're going to be doing in New York, right? So there are things that we've really thought about from this trip and are now trying to turn into real policy change. I think the first, and it's been in the comments a bunch here too, is that globally, kids are kids. Like we met a bunch of students. The students are all still grappling with who they're going to be, what path they're going to follow. They make mistakes along the way. And what I also thought was really interesting is they do feel the pressure to go to college and university in Europe just as much as they feel that here in America. So I think there's a huge effort and emphasis around how we have to think about pathways and how we communicate pathways and credentials for good jobs. One of the things we talked about in our state is if you're going to be a computer coder, there's 5 different ways to do it. Why aren't we talking about the job, not so much about the credential or pathway? And so it's not about you having to go to university. You can be a computer coder with a great apprenticeship program. The second, and this, I think Laura mentioned this a bit, is the business investment and engagement in the German apprenticeship model is next level. Like I'm not sure I can even quite describe how next level it is because we have nothing really comparison that we can compare it to here in the US. And when it comes down to it, employers see this as their responsibility and that they are 100% committed to the outcome of people who live in their community. So it's a really different investment model. And I think for us in our state, we're really thinking about how do we actually start to encourage a different investment model with the business community. So it's less about what we can do for the business community and more about really what the partnership really looks like. The other big piece for us was around, and Amy mentioned this, the fact that Germany is so crystal clear on what credentials mean and what that portability looks like, I think we have a ton of work to do in our state to really think about that curriculum alignment. And so as Amy mentioned around this collaborative approach, I think we really need to have a regional and statewide approach in New York around curriculum alignment. So the K-12 CTE, the initial post-secondary work, as well as sort of the post-secondary work, the upskilling work really needs to be aligned and also clear, but also that you get credit for all that work. So we actually are going to be pushing, even as part of our COVID recovery work, the need for credit for prior learning to be something that's standardized across New York. And in some ways creating a curriculum passport or a credential passport. So statewide, your work and experience is actually counted towards something and it's clearly communicated to employers. The last thing I would think I will say is like, we can do this. And I think the fact that we took the time to go to another place to be inspired is an important thing to do as workforce professionals. I think we get so caught in the weeds of just trying to make sure our WIOA paperwork is done sometimes that we often forget there's really incredible models across the country and across the nation. And I just really encourage folks to take the time to do it because I know we all left with a couple of really key things that inspired us to do something different when we get home. So those are my nuggets of thoughts here, Joe.
Thank you for sharing that. I can do this. You know, we're willing to take on that work, and I know that in Michigan we have a lot of efforts already around apprenticeships. We have at the state level people seeking additional funding to help support apprenticeships. So we're really in the middle of this work, and I think some of the things that we saw over in Germany can help us with moving forward. So I did promise some time for some question and answer, but I also want to be respectful of everyone's times within the conference. So since we're so close to the end time, I think we tried to answer as many of your questions as we went along in the chat. But I'm going to put my contact information into the chat box as well. Feel free to email me any follow-up questions that you might have from this, and I will do my best to put together some responses along with the group here. So I appreciate everyone for spending an hour of time with us as we talked about our experience over in Germany, what we were able to take back. I hope this is something that we're able to keep moving things forward and keep the conversation going. I want to thank all of the panelists for participating today, taking some time out of your schedule to do so. Appreciate your time. So thanks everyone for joining us. And like I said, if you have any questions about what we experienced, feel free to email me as well, and be happy to answer that. So thank you very much.